Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to episode 3 of Isaac's Reading Nook. Now, given that in episodes 1 and 2 I was discussing very recently published books about relatively popular musicians and artists, it should be fairly obvious that episode 3 is about Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Yeah, when I said I didn't think anyone was going to guess this, I meant it. The truth is, this is the first Charles Dickens novel I've ever read, but I'm very glad that I spontaneously decided to give this one a try, because it's so much better and so much funnier than I expected. Seriously, there were multiple times where this book made me laugh out loud in my own living room. There was one time it even made me laugh on a train, so that's how you know I'm serious. Also, there's an entire scene in one of the early chapters which I found so funny that I actually went to the effort of reenacting and recreating this scene for your entertainment, but mostly for mine. Please enjoy. Swine were the companions of the prodigal. The gluttony of swine is put before us as an example to the young. What is detestable in a pig is more detestable in a boy. Or girl. Of course, or girl, Mr. Hubble, but there is no girl present. Besides, think what you've got to be grateful for. If you had been born a squeaker...
He was, if ever a boy was.
Well, but I mean a four-footed squeaker. If you had been born such, would you be here now? No, not you. Unless in that form. But I don't mean in that form, sir. I mean enjoying himself with his elders and betters, and improving himself with their conversation, and rolling in the lap of luxury. Would he have been doing that? No, he wouldn't. And what would have been your destination? You would have been disposed of for so many shillings according to the market price of the article, and Mr. Dunstable the butcher would have come up to you as you lay in your straw, and he would have whipped you under his left arm, and with his right he would have tucked up his frock to get a penknife from out of his waistcoat pocket, and he would have shed your blood and had your life. No bringing up by hand then. Not a bit of it. I will say it took me an unreasonably long time to set up and get all of those shots. There's a good reason I'm not an actor or a director, but I had fun making it. And I had fun reading this book, which is the main thing I want to emphasize in this review. This was a much more fun read than I expected. Of course, the subject matter, the setting, there's some darkness to it. There's some kind of classic Victorian drabness to it. But there was so much more humour in this than I expected. Not in the sense that Charles Dickens writes, jokes with an obvious punchline in the middle of a novel, but the situations and the characters are written with so much irony. It's more, there's a lot of dry humour in it. There's a lot of little observations by the main character and narrator Pip, which just make you laugh with how observant or how wry the comments are. I also got a good laugh from certain lines in which Pip is just taking subtle jabs at this particularly pompous character called Mr. Pumblechook. Now, I'll try not to spoil anything major in the plot in this video, but Mr. Pumblechook is not a particularly significant adversary or villain or anything, but he's just a very insufferable character, and it's quite funny when Pip just, mutters to the reader, in a sense, something about Mr. Pumblechook, and some of those were some of my highlights of the entire book. There are also some other positive points besides just how comedic I found this. One is that the characters are very larger than life. All of them are very memorable, even some of the side characters that don't have a huge amount of screen time. There's one called Mr. Wopsle, who I just can't stop picturing he's only in a couple of scenes throughout the whole book, but even he's memorable. As for the main characters, there's one in particular, Joe, who I mentioned earlier. He's the brother-in-law of Pip, and I actually wrote down in my book, alongside the quote that I found particularly funny, I wrote down, "I love Joe, he is so pure, he deserves the world. I swear he had better not die in this story, or I will have some choice words for Charles Dickens." Now, again, no spoilers. I'm not going to say whether Joe or any other characters die or not, but that's just how invested I was in both this story and some of these characters. Another thing I noted down, and that I would 100% have talked about if I was studying this book for GCSE English Literature, is the theme of class, which is fairly obvious. I mean, he's writing about characters set in Victorian England. It's hard to do that without class at least being a part of the backdrop. And here it's more than the backdrop. It's one of the driving factors for the story, if anything, and for a lot of the characters and their motivations. But I find it really interesting the way that he does. I think it's often very good show don't tell writing. There's one scene in particular which I noted down for doing this particularly well, in which the main character Pip is interacting with a much more upper class character called Estella, who says, "He calls the knaves jacks, this boy," said Estella with disdain before our first game was out. "And what coarse hands he has, and what thick boots." I had never thought of being ashamed of my hands before, but I began to consider them a very indifferent pair. Her contempt for me was so strong that it became infectious, and I caught it. I find that quote genuinely very poignant, because it's not only discussing classism, but internalized classism. You know, we're watching the process of Pip internalizing Estella's classism and disdain for him in real time and hearing it from his perspective, which is kind of upsetting. The only other quote I wrote down from this book isn't actually to do with classism, but I found it more philosophical, almost weirdly existential. But I found it very interesting and relevant both to this story and to life in general, actually. This is just Pip's own narration to the reader, in a sense. And he says, "That was a memorable day to me, for it made great changes in me. But it is the same with any life. Imagine one selected day struck out of it, and think how different its course would have been. Pause, you who read this, and think for a moment of the long chain of iron or gold, of thorns or flowers, that would never have bound you, but for the formation of the first link on one memorable day." It reminds me of the plot of Shrek Forever After, actually. Shrek references aside, I genuinely think that's an interesting quote and an interesting way to think about the story that he's actually a character in. It's weird how he almost breaks the fourth wall in calling out the reader directly. Either way, just one of plenty of fascinating and thought-provoking lines in this novel. In summary, I very much enjoyed Great Expectations, a lot more than I thought I would. It was funny, the story was interesting, there were times where I genuinely couldn't put it down. There was actually one time when I was on a train that was so busy I had to stand for the entire 2 hours from Birmingham to Manchester, and for those entire 2 hours, me standing up, I just read this book. Did not get bored. Fantastic writing. I can't wait to read more of Charles Dickens. Furthermore, very interesting themes like classism and the butterfly effect of, you know, small, seemingly insignificant events that have massive consequences later on. And ultimately, a very good experience reading this. 4.5 stars out of 5. Can recommend. Also, one last thing before I go, there are 2 different times in this book where a character says the words Great Expectations out loud, and both times my reaction was like that meme of Leonardo DiCaprio where he's just pointing at the TV. I was like, he said the thing, he said the line. Great experience, loved it both times. Do read this. Bye.